Hello and welcome to the Bible Uncut. I am your host, R.L. Watson, and today we're looking at the question, do we need a chapter and verse for everything, or can we leave room for the voice of God?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, hello, welcome back. This is the podcast all about being shaped not by simply Scripture alone, but by all of Scripture. If you're just joining us this episode, it's great to have you here. And when you finish this episode, I invite you, please, go back, listen to some of my previous episodes. If you enjoy what you hear today, or if you're returning, you haven't done so yet, please hit follow, leave a rating, or you could even leave a review. That would be awesome. Also, if you want to contact me, questions, comments, maybe general feedback about the episodes, or even any questions you might like me to address in future episodes, I would love to hear from you. You can either use the contact form on the podcast webpage, or you can send me an email at the Bible Uncut Podcast, and that's all one word, the Bible Uncut Podcast @gmail.com. Just one last little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you're looking for another podcast to fill your week and add to your learning, then look, I would like to recommend The Chorus in the Chaos. Now, this isn't a paid sponsorship. I just like sharing good resources. On their Blake, Jack, and Grayson, they offer insightful, interesting, and thoughtful discussions on a whole range of different topics. And look, as you listen, you may not agree with everything they say, but I believe there's value in listening to the ideas and the issues, taking the time to step back and weigh up their points. And look, regardless of where you stand at the end, I think you'll definitely go away with maybe a fresh appreciation for that topic. So check out The Chorus in the Chaos, and I'll put the details in the show notes for you. A few weeks ago, I stumbled across a message from The Well Church. This is a non-denominational church in California, and it was a message that got me thinking. As I was listening, there were some points that I thought they were interesting. Some points I thought, yeah, this is good. But the underlying message, the idea that was at the heart of the sermon, it was something that kind of concerned me. This isn't about the church. Look, I don't know a lot about them. Their, statement of faith, pretty orthodox, pretty straightforward. This isn't about this church. It's not about saying, hey, this is a church. Look careful. Nothing like that. It's just a concept that came through their sermon that I think needs addressing. It's a growing issue. It's a growing message that I'm hearing. The sermon's big picture message was about allowing ourselves to be more aware of what God is saying, what God is doing, and being willing to be pushed outside our comfort zone as the Lord leads us along. And look, I could totally agree with this idea. It's biblical. You just have to look at Moses and him being challenged to speak to Pharaoh, or Esther having to convince the king to save the Jews. So I can agree there. We should allow God to push us outside our comfort zones. But there was more to it than just getting us to face our fears. What if that point of tension, what if that comfort zone, what if that boundary was that what I'm being led to contradicts Scripture? Not a misunderstanding of Scripture, but clear, explicit Scripture. So what was being promoted alongside this challenge of being open to God speaking is the claim that God can change his mind about what is, about what isn't acceptable, and that he can contradict himself. Part of the message was the preacher challenging the idea of wanting chapter and verse to test something that they believe God is telling him. He kind of rubbishes this approach when he gives a hypothetical about someone, maybe today, hearing a voice of God telling them to go do something that we're not allowed to do. And here's what he says. If it ever goes against conservative evangelical Christianity, someone will go, whoa, give me a chapter and verse on that. How about the voice of God? Like, do we make room for that? Or do we make room for God to show up and speak? I don't think this is exactly what the speaker was trying to do, but this is really similar to what I hear when someone tries to say something about God that doesn't line up with Scripture. They'll say, hey, why don't we leave room for the voice of God? The old, don't put God in a box, or I have a relationship with God, not a book. Those arguments. I don't think he was doing that, but it was quite similar. Now, I believe God can change his mind. He has the authority to do so. He is king, he is Lord. If he wants to change his mind, he can do it. But when I read scripture, when I read what God says about his word, I really don't think that he will. Plus, this idea that God can change his mind, this doesn't sound like the firm foundation of theology that Paul described in Ephesians 4, of being no longer tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness, and deceitful schemes. If God can change his mind, you don't get that firm foundation. But if God does change something 2,000 years later, if he wants us to walk in the truth, he would need to make sure that we knew this clearly. So the preacher is essentially telling us, look, it doesn't matter if God contradicts previous revelation. That was essentially what he was saying. And I can sort of imagine that his point was you need to be open and willing to what God's saying. And that might be a barrier for some people to listen and follow what God is leading in. But he's saying it doesn't matter if it contradicts previous revelation. As evidence, as a kind of case study to prove that God can do this, he goes through Acts 10 and he looks at Peter's encounter with the Lord and with Cornelius, and he makes the claim that this is an example of how God changed his mind about the law. But we need to stop. We need to step back and look and think, is that even what happened in this passage in Acts 10? Because it raises the issue. If God can change his mind there, can God change his mind about other things? Now, today I'm not going to go through the whole message. I'm not going to go point by point. I'm just going to focus on a couple of points from the message. I want to focus on the claim that Acts 10 teaches that God changed the law regarding food and regarding Gentiles. So let's look at the issue of food. First thing I want to talk about is his commentary on Peter's vision of the sheet and the animals. The preacher makes the point about how confronting it would be for Peter as a Jew to be told, eat these animals. And we can say that Peter is definitely confronted because we see the words from Peter, no, Lord. Does Peter not remember what happened the last time he said that? Back in Matthew 16. What's interesting is not so much that he reads from the New Living Translation, the NLT, but the wording that that translation offers. Not that this is a critique of the translation. Maybe it's just a translation used by the church. I don't think he was choosing it nefariously or trying to manipulate. But this is how the NLT renders the verse. See if you notice anything interesting about the wording, if this is a passage you sort of read and familiar with. It goes, starting in verse 11. He saw the sky open, and something like a large sheet was let down by its four corners. In the sheet were all sorts of animals, reptiles, and birds. Then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat them." "No, Lord," Peter declared. "I have never eaten anything that our Jewish laws have declared impure and unclean." If you've read this in another translation often, it should stand out to you that a phrase has been added. Here's how it reads in the ESV. But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Adding the phrase, according to the Jewish law, makes it sound like God is changing the law, right? And that God is going back on previous revelation. The original Greek, and I cannot find another translation that uses that phrase. Now, you might be thinking, but this is a paraphrase capturing the essence of what's happening. But we do need to ask two related questions. Is God changing the law in this encounter with Peter? And is the category of common a part of Jewish law? In order for us to better understand what's happening in this encounter and answer these questions, we need to look at two key words: common, or impure, as it's rendered in the NLT, and unclean. These are the Greek words koinon and akatharton. The word unclean, it's pretty straightforward. We're pretty familiar with this. It's describing something that's ceremonially unacceptable. The law outlines this category as including things like animal carcasses and blood, maybe something touched a carcass, and the unclean animals from Leviticus 11. The other word, common, gets a little tricky. If you type in the word common in something like Bible Gateway in English, you're going to get a lot of results based on a number of, based on the semantic range of the word common. One of the few, relevant instances is Leviticus 10:10. It says, "You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean." The word behind common, Babylon, is the opposite of holy. One way to think of it is as profane and as corrupted. Another way, so based on its semantic range, is a range of meaning. Words can have multiple meanings. But it can also simply mean something that it's not consecrated. It's not consecrated. It's just everyday. But even this word isn't used very often in the law. The specific Greek word that Peter uses here, well, the word used by Luke to capture what Peter's saying here, koinon, you'll find is very hardly used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. The word koinos and its variants are found 3 times, only 3 times in the Greek Old Testament. It's not used in Leviticus 11. It's not even used in the whole Torah. But it is found in Proverbs. And it's used to describe something that's shared, like a bag of money, or it's used to describe a home. It could also mean something like something from the everyday, nothing special. And it's kind of a synonym with Babylon, the other word for common. So what is Peter talking about when he says he hasn't eaten anything that is common? If it's not really found in the Old Testament, then we need to sort of look a little bit beyond it to understand what does Peter mean. We should work out by now that the word common, as it's being used in Acts 10, has a new meaning from what it was used in the book of Proverbs. Remember, common can mean something that's just everyday. Was Peter trying to say he's never eaten food that was not consecrated at the temple, or just an everyday bread roll or something? I mean, that makes no sense. I've never eaten anything that was not consecrated. Of course he has. Of course he's eaten food that's common in that sense. But by the 1st century, the word common had come to mean that something had been contaminated by Gentiles and idols. This category, to be common, was not a part of the law. It was not a part of the Torah, but it was a part of Pharisee tradition. What we need to understand about the Pharisees is that they like to take the laws regarding the temple, the ceremonies like washing, for example, and they say it applies to the everyday, everywhere. That's why they got upset with Jesus in Mark 7 for not washing their hands. This is all where it came from. The word common had become connected with the concept of polluting. So polluting something. And we find an example of this in 2 Chronicles 36, describing how the house of the Lord was polluted with idols. But the passage doesn't use koinos, but the meaning and concept of this term sort of got carried over, so the meaning of polluted could attach to common. Leviticus describes this concept when describing an unclean lizard or a bug falling into a pot, and then the pot becomes unclean. But they're never described as common, and this idea was never used of people eating unclean food. Very important to note that. So when we see common in the New Testament, this is often the meaning behind it. Something has been polluted by something connected to Gentiles. And so the issue of common is what God was challenging Peter about. And I think this is really clear when we see the Lord's response to Peter. What God has made clean, do not call common. The term used to describe the process of make clean is only ever used of things that have been corrupted. Never for making something that was inherently unclean and then making it clean. So we don't see an animal corpse being cleansed. It's also used when a priest inspects leprosy and says, this is a clean type. So how does this idea of polluting and corrupting fit into Peter's vision? Well, when you look at the description, you can see that in the sheet there were clean and there were unclean animals. And according to this popular but unbiblical category of common, the clean animals, which God had pronounced as clean, have become polluted by the unclean animals. So in the sheet we have the common and unclean animals. Peter has eaten neither. Peter's never eaten a corrupted clean animal, and he's never eaten an unclean animal. But God is effectively saying, you need to get the category of common out of your head. Because we notice God didn't say, don't call things unclean. He says, don't call them common. So we can see, and what is good about the sermon is that the preacher said, what the rest of the story of Acts 10 makes clear is, this vision is not really about food. But from what we can see by the use of the terminology, is that God is not changing the law in this vision. And look, I know there's debate about the ongoing validity of the food laws, and my focus for this podcast isn't on that debate. But what is clear is this verse is not evidence for its discontinuity. God is challenging Peter about the category of common, of being polluted and corrupted by Gentiles. And this becomes very, very clear when we look at the rest of the passage. So that was the issue with the food laws. Second topic is about the Gentiles. The sermon has a bit more of a conversation about visions, etc., and then jumps into when Peter is at Cornelius' house. The preacher points out how Peter said to his audience when he's at Cornelius' house. Peter says, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Here Peter recognizes that the whole vision was about people, not food. You see, the Jews believed that the Gentiles were unclean, and that they would contaminate them and pollute them, causing them to become common. This is why Jews didn't eat with Gentiles. And when you read Jewish literature from the intertestamental period in the first century, you can see a lot of anti-Gentile content and belief. But the preacher picks up on this term. It is unlawful for a Jew to visit a Gentile, and he says, here God is changing the law. God is changing the law to make it permissible for them to associate together. He says that this was a very clearly spoken rule, and that much of the Old Testament, the rules and regulations for Jews, are now being challenged. But saying that God is changing the law is based on the belief that the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, was purely for the Jews, Gentiles are not welcome, but the New Covenant is this new thing with a new group, as though God was starting over. And at a glance, when Peter said it was unlawful to be in a Gentile's home, it certainly sounds like the law prohibited Jews from interacting with Gentiles. But Peter is not referring to the Torah. Peter uses a word that describes something that is a taboo, something culturally forbidden. And we can know this is certainly the case because when we look at the biblical text, when we look at the law, we can see there are no laws, 0 laws, forbidding Jews to associate with Gentiles. There are prohibitions against certain Gentiles that they are to have no covenant with, which is essentially the 7 Canaanite nations that they were conquering, and the Ammonites and the Moabites. But that's it. If Gentiles were to be wholesale excluded, nope, you cannot be a part of this, then why were there Gentiles as Israelite citizens? Caleb, Ruth, Rahab, Obed-Edom, all Gentiles, and all called Israelites. Being an Israelite, we need to remember this. Being an Israelite was not an ethnic limitation. In a lot of places in the ancient world, belonging to a nation, if you want to use that term back then, wasn't about bloodline. It wasn't so much about ethnicity or genetics. It's about a common language, common belief, a common religion, common education, common customs. Then if you shared those, you are part of that nation. For example, if someone was born in what is now modern Turkey, they were considered Greek if they had a Greek education, they spoke the language, worshipped the same God, even if there's not a drop of Greek blood in their body. It was a very similar thing with Israel. I mean, to see that the Gentiles were not to be excluded, we only have to look at Isaiah 56. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. The foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants. Everyone who keeps the Sabbath and doesn't profane it, and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So here, God invites the Gentiles to participate in the temple worship, what some might call the ceremonial law. What Jesus accomplished by bringing in the nations in fulfillment to the oath made to Abraham was something that begun and was taught throughout the Old Testament. What changed was the volume. So, in Acts 10, there was no cancelling of laws or teachings that kept out Gentiles. The belief that it was changed is based on a misreading of certain New Testament passages. As I said before, in the minds of the Jews of the first century, Gentiles were bad. And there's good historical reasons for them to think so. And when the New Testament authors challenges this mindset, they're not challenging the law, they're challenging a bad tradition. So the New Covenant is nothing about a new program with a new group of people. Does it look a bit different? Absolutely. There's no temple, no active priesthood, the ratio of Gentiles is much greater, but it's still following the same plan. God is gathering and creating a people for himself from all nations. God's boundaries have not changed. This belief in a totally new program is what leads people to ignore and cut off the first 2/3 of our Bible. The main goal of the message from the World Church was to encourage Christians to be willing to be challenged by God on certain ideas, maybe about who's in and who's out, and about what God will ask you to do. And look, I am all for God challenging those extra-biblical and false traditions. But the preacher is using the example of Peter and Cornelius and claiming that God is changing the law, like God is changing actual revelation there. And what he's saying is we should be open to him changing his law and word now. And look, this is kind of dangerous. And it does open that door to error. I don't believe the preacher meant it intentionally. But it does leave that possibility. And yes, while the sermon might affect some of our theology, and look, a disagreeable point at that, I think it opens up a greater issue. This kind of thinking that God can contradict previous revelation allows people to be open to error. I want you to imagine someone is tempted to cheat on their spouse. This is an extreme example, and no doubt the preacher will probably push back on this. But I think he'd have a tough time doing so consistently. So this person, they know that the law, God's rules, God's commandments, prohibits adultery. But you know what? They pray. They want to know, what's God saying in this moment? They're making room for the voice of the Lord, not relying on a chapter and verse. And they believe God is telling them it's okay. They tell a friend about this, and they respond with, look, I don't think God is speaking to you if that's what you got. Now imagine they respond with the line that the preacher gives. Well, how about the voice of God? Like, do we make room for that? Do we make room for God to show up and speak? It can run us into trouble. There are church movements that promote its members to be willing to go off map, to go outside of orthodoxy and scripture, so that they can support their questionable theology. This idea is a shift from sola scriptura to sola experience. While some will want to claim that the law changed in the New Testament, when we look into the context, we look into the setting and cultural background, even the language, we can see that many verses that supposedly claim the law was done away with or the law was changed, these laws were nullified, they don't actually say that. I think as students of Scripture, we do well to follow the biblical example. God says in Deuteronomy, don't divert from what I've told you. Do not shift from my word. And even Jesus, he questions his audience when he's asked theological questions. Have you not read what God said to you? We need to listen to what God has said to us. In today's world where heresies are only limited by people's emotions and creativity, we need a good foundation that we can rest upon to know what is true and to know what has God spoken. And being open to God giving us something new, giving us something different, is not a good solution. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Maybe we got a little technical in places, and look, perhaps this might be a little bit difficult to follow, especially if this is all new. So I'll lay this out in the show notes so you can go back, make some better sense of it. But I do hope that this has helped you understand some of the biblical background and equipped you to understand this passage better. But more importantly, big picture, I hope you can recognize the importance of being guided by Scripture alone and being aware of the dangers of those who want to encourage you to maybe ignore it. If you've been blessed by this podcast, make sure you subscribe, keep up with each episode, and if you know someone who will benefit from this podcast, please share it so that others may be blessed as well. I'm excited for next Thursday. I'm having author David Wilber in to talk about his book, How Jesus Fulfilled the Law, based on Matthew 5. So be sure to drop back in for that episode. Looking forward to it. So thanks again. I'm R.L. Watson, and this has been the Bible Uncut.